Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to the fourth webinar in our post-2020 series. We're very excited to have you on the line and to be joined by such a variety of attendees. And today we will be exploring the position paper on local and subnational governments and some of the emerging key messages and ambitions for shaping the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. My name is Timothy Blatch. I'm with ICLEI Africa and the ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Center. I'm also the coordinator for Cities with Nature, and I will be moderating the session today. Before we start, I should just mention that the session is recorded and the recording will be made available to you once the webinar is finished. And we will have time for some questions and discussions at the end of the webinar, should there be any. So we ask that you hold any of your thoughts until then, at which point there will be two ways to ask questions, and that's either to raise your hand using the panel on the right, or to submit a question via the question text box, also on the right. So without further ado, thank you again for joining us, and as you can see on your screen, today's agenda, we're joined by Ingrid Coetzee, who is the Senior Manager for Biodiversity and Nature-Based Solutions at ICLEI Africa and the Cities Biodiversity Center, and she's going to provide an overview of the ICLEI-led process to develop a position paper in consultation with our local and subnational government constituency, and some of the key thematic focus areas that are emerging through that process. Following Ingrid, we have Renata Gomez from Regions 4, previously NRG for SD, and Renata will be presenting an overview of the Regions 4 led process on behalf of the subnational government constituency, as well as some impressions from the Trondheim conference. Then we have Mr. Oliver Hillel from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And unfortunately, he is unable to join us in person in this morning's webinar. He will be joining us later on in the second session today. But for purposes of this webinar, I will try to play a recording, a voice recording of his presentation. But when we send the recorded webinar, his presentation will be included in both versions. And then finally, we're very excited to have Mr. Shu Zhu, who's the Regional Director of ICLEI in South Asia. And he's going to provide a brief overview and some feedback from an exciting event that took place, I think it's the 18th of July in Beijing, a roundtable on urban biodiversity actions and local and subnational government biodiversity practices on the road to post-2020. So that is our overall agenda, and at the end, as I mentioned, we will have some time for questions and discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ingrid, and she is going to take us through. So thank you, Ingrid.
Hi, hello everybody. Ingrid speaking here, and as Tim said, I'm just going to give you an overview of the process that's involved in developing a position paper, specifically the process that ICLEI is leading at the moment. This is not the only process, there are many, and we're going to hear a little later from Renata what her own organization's Regions 4 is doing, and Oliver is also going to tell us about some of the other initiatives. So essentially what I want to start off by is just putting this into context for those of you that are maybe not that familiar with the whole role that local and subnational governments have been playing over the more than a decade or so in terms of making sure that the voice and the interests and the positions of local and subnational governments are communicated to and heard within the negotiation platforms of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So there are a couple of important pointers in this respect. The one is the Global Biodiversity Summits of local and subnational governments that are held and as an official parallel event at each COP, Conference of Parties, and these have been held since 2008. Which ICLEI has co-convened together with the host cities and country, as well as the Secretariat on Convention of Biological Diversity. And then since 2018, which was the last COP 14 in Egypt, we had Regions 4 as also one of the partners in co-convening that summit. In addition to the actual summits, which are very important platforms where we get representatives of cities and metropolitan areas, states, provinces, prefectures, and other levels of subnational government from all over the world together to engage with the CBD parties to demonstrate, how collective action at the local level is made and it contributes to the implementation of the CBD targets. There are also coming from these summits what we call declarations or communiques, which is a statement then showing what the local and subnational governments have done, what they're committing to, and what they're calling on parties. And there are about 8 or 9 of these statements. There's the whole history of these statements. And then the third thing is that alongside this movement of having summits and the summit declarations, the constituency of local and subnational governments has influenced a range of COP decisions since 2008. Initially just very tentatively saying that we are important players, and then at the last COP there were a number of decisions that reflected and recognized the role of subnational governments in a wide range of issues, from things like wildlife meat to nature and health issues, and obviously also very importantly the role that subnationals play in mainstreaming of biodiversity. So just to give you some background on what are the sources and ideas that are shaping the development of a position which ICLEI is working on in terms of how our constituency, in other words, what are the sort of voice that we want and the message that we want to communicate. There are a number of these things. It's not just something that's dreamt up in an office somewhere. There is obviously pulling on the previous communiques, the most recent one from last year. Then there are 2 more recent documents that have come out this year at very important meetings. The one is the Common Roadmap for Cities, Metropolitan Areas, Local and Subnational Governments towards living in harmony with nature, which is an outcome of a meeting that was held in Paris in June of this year. And then even a few weeks ago, there was an important meeting of all metropolitan areas from across the world that met in Medellin in Colombia, and that gave rise to the Abura Valley Medellin Declaration of Metropolitan Areas to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, I'm not going to deal with these because Oliver is going to give you some background and some more information on both of those documents. Other things that we are taking into consideration is the COP decisions, then the plan of action on subnational governments, cities and other local authorities for biodiversity. This plan of action was adopted in Nagoya in 2010, and its framework or term of reference ends at 2020. So that's also something that we've been looking at. And then, of course, very importantly, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the assessment reports that came out in May of this year. I think those have been quite seminal in influencing our ideas on what it is and getting, and how local governments are responding and picking up on some of those very important messages that have come out there. And then there are other structures within the CBD process. The Informal Advisory Group, they're also making statements, and the Open-Ended Working Group has just recently produced some documents. So as we consult our local and subnational members within the ICLEI family, these are obviously things that are coming to the fore. People are raising issues that have come out of either IPBES or previous COP decisions or communiques, etc. And these are all things that we are taking consideration of. And then also I just want to note that in addition to the work that we're doing, there are also important messages and statements coming from our various partners, These include Regions 4, the Committee of Regions, the group of leading subnational governments towards the Aichi biodiversity targets, the IUCN, TNC, and many more. So if we now step back a little bit and look at what are the emerging key themes and trends that relate specifically to local and subnational governments insofar as the post-2020 global biodiversity framework is concerned, there are a number of things that I just want to highlight that we are picking up on. And one of them is the issue of mainstreaming. And what we're seeing and the messages that we're hearing from our constituency, but also from elsewhere, is that mainstreaming of biodiversity into the sectors, be they agriculture or transport or mining, or whatever the case may be, is viewed as at the core of transformative change. So this is something that is really important in the messages that we're getting from our constituency. Another thing that is important is the issue of resource mobilization. And then linked to that is the idea of there are different enablers, including the issue of resource mobilization and financing and funding. There's also the issue of capacity building, and then management tools. And there's a range of management tools that are coming to light. Some of these have already been in existence for a while, for example, environmental impact assessments, but things that are coming to the fore, and increasingly we're hearing people talk about these and say to what extent can these be involved and how we're going to use them, etc., is, for example, natural capital accounting, valuation, ecosystem services assessment, etc. And then finally, another important enabler is the whole idea of legal instruments, and obviously both all the subnational levels of government have a range of legal tools and instruments that they can use, and they feel that these are also important enablers in contributing to the new deal for nature, the new global biodiversity framework. Something else that we are hearing from our constituency and also from outside is the fact that there's a need for engagement measures, what these are, how they should look at. There are different ideas, and we are trying to sort of come up with something that's concrete and unified. And then also the discussion around the need for an integrated approach for sustainable cities, and the need to link, for example, the SDGs, the climate targets, and the biodiversity targets in a more integrated approach as opposed to a siloed approach, and the various mechanisms that one can use for this. And the IPBES has come up with a very good summation and sort of almost a model, not so much a model, but a concept for these things, for the whole concept of integrated approach and linking it to sustainability. And the four main themes that are coming out there are the issues of urban planning, which links again to the issue of mainstreaming, then the role of nature-based solutions and green infrastructure, also has links to mainstreaming, but to resource mobilization, capacity building, etc. How to reduce the impact of cities, the various measures and tools that one can use, and the importance of accessing services, urban services for a good quality of life. And I think what we're seeing is that there's a greater shift away from sort of conventional approaches to biodiversity to linking it closer to social, health-related economic issues. Another very important thing that we're looking at and thinking about in terms of our position statement is the whole area of voluntary commitments, not just at the level of national governments, but specifically also at subnational levels, be this a province or a prefecture or a metropolitan authority or a big city or a small city. What are the voluntary commitments that they need to make and want to make, as they are indicating to us, and how these contribute towards the national and then obviously meeting global targets, so that there's almost a sort of a cascading up of targets that you have the idea of collective local action feeding into and making global impact. Then something else that we're picking up is and that actually comes forth, was linked to the whole idea of voluntary commitments, is the importance of monitoring and evaluation, increasingly seeing calls for this. the whole idea of reporting, verification, monitoring, measuring what changes we've made, what's the impact been, etc. And together with this, the idea of using Cities with Nature as the platform on which local and subnational governments can very easily and collectively give effect to their responsibilities as far as that's concerned. As far as goals and targets are concerned, we've heard the call from the CBD and the Bureau and the parties for smart targets, strengthening that. And it's been interesting to see that the open-ended working group have come up with a sort of a proposed or a potential structure, and they, in terms of goals, they focus on biodiversity status and biodiversity health, which comes back to the point I made earlier, with that we're seeing a greater move towards the more social, the soft side of things. And then insofar as targets, they're focusing very specifically on issues of biodiversity loss. And then finally, also, what are the enabling conditions and actions that one would need to achieve this? So just before I talk a little bit about the process, just to sum up from ICLEI's perspective, the things that we are busy formulating, and I'm not able to share this with you at the moment because we still need to go through our own political structures, consult our mayors at the regional and the global level, and we're in the process of doing that at the moment. But essentially, we speak to issues of multi-level governance and territorial approaches. And I think that the emphasis is also saying and making the point that local and subnational level governments can actually support the action at national level of government. Another important thing that we've highlighted, which links to voluntary commitments, MRV, for example, is the issue of really having good and solid and robust data, and the importance of analysis so that we know where we're going and what the gaps are. The issue, or not the issue, the importance of partnering, which is a very active thing and a very important thing. This is not something that we can do on our own, whether we're talking of national parties or of the subnational levels of government or the business sector or the civil society out there. And while I mentioned civil society, I just want to raise the point that we're also talking and looking at the role of urban communities and the fact that they have a very important role here. And then I think the question, obviously, of we need funds, we need money to make all of this happen. So obviously the issue of investment in biodiversity, in nature-based solutions, in green infrastructure, in making the shifts and achieving the transformation. The other point that we're making is that where we recognize that the role of subnational governments has been recognized and reflected in past decisions, it's now the time to upscale and outscale and to raise the bar, raise the ambition as far as that is concerned. And then, as I said, the last point I made when I was talking about trends is the whole issue of monitoring, reporting and verification, and the use of the Cities with Data platform, which is a platform, and I just want to emphasize that that is not an ICLEI platform. This is a partnership platform. It includes all of the partners. We're in the process of signing, I think it's about 50 agreements with a very wide range of institutions, including the IUCN and TNC, which are our founding partners. There are others, such as the World Urban Parks, Committee of Regions, the Biophilic Cities, Regions 4. Yeah, the list is endless. As I said, we're talking where there's a list of about 50 at the moment. So just very briefly, I want to just point out to you what our process is. It's a very complicated process. It is, sorry, I seem to have skipped a slide. Can I go up? Yeah, it is an iterative process and it's consultative, and that's why it takes so much time. And some of the key milestones in this process going forward now is that we will float our zero draft, or in CBD speak, what they call a non-paper, where we will reflect what the ICLEI constituency position is for the first time at the open-ended working group in Nairobi at the end of this month. And then once we've done that, we will obviously start consulting more openly, wider with the local government and subnational constituency and our partners. So in other words, this will go beyond just the ICLEI membership for additions, for support, etc. The next big milestone will be then to provide a first draft at the second open-ended working group, which is going to be held in Kunming. And then that will be the first sort of real substantive draft. And then after that, and throughout the process, you know, as I said, it's an iterative process, so we will continue making changes, we'll continue adding, we'll continue engaging with partners, with our own constituency to improve and to enhance this draft. And then we want to have a sort of near final draft ready by May 2020 to present or to float at the SBI 3 meeting. We will also be discussing the draft position at the IUCN World Congress in Marseille in June 2020. And the objective is to have a final position ready by the 3rd meeting of the open-ended working group, which is taking place in July 2020 in Bogota. And then just to end off, to say that we're working in very close consultation with the CBD, and once we're once we've got our ICLEI approved version, obviously we will also start negotiating, or not negotiating, consulting and engaging very closely with our other partners and with other networks. I also just want to make the announcement that Mayor Plante from Montreal in Canada has accepted the sort of position of being a global ambassador for local biodiversity, and she will be the front runner of our campaign. We are going to be making a formal announcement through the press release within the next 2 weeks on this. We have a whole campaign planned out for her, so she's going to be engaging at some key meetings and summits and forums, and she will also announce the sort of zero draft of our position that we will be presenting to, or not presenting, sorry, floating at the open-ended working group in Nairobi. In addition to this, we have our regular webinar series, and we want to use this webinar series to communicate where we are in terms of the position, developing the position, but also to use the webinar series to elicit responses and inputs and additions and support from our constituency and from the people that are participating. And as Tim said earlier, it's quite a wide range of interest groups that are participating in this webinar series. I've already said that once it's in the public domain, we will communicate it more broadly, and we'll do this also through making it available on our website. And then just the last thing to say, if there are any inputs from the participants to this webinar, both this morning and this afternoon, it needn't be in the webinar itself. We've got till next week, Thursday. We would really welcome any written inputs. It doesn't have to be much detail. You can just make it very short and concise. We're not looking at a very long document, but we would really value any inputs from the participants. And we ask that you submit that to the following email addresses by the 8th. So that's today a week. Thank you very much, Tim.
Great, thank you, Ingrid, for that. I'll leave the email addresses just for a second while I introduce the next speaker. In the being mindful of time, I won't dawdle anymore, but we're really excited to have Renata Gomez with us. She was in the previous webinar as well from Regions 4, and she's going to be presenting a little bit on their process with the subnational constituency. So Renata, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone listening. It's a pleasure to be here again to, like you said, introduce what we are doing to contribute to the post-2020 process. Next slide, please. I'll briefly show you the next slide, please. The objectives of my intervention today. So I would like to discuss a little further, and this is for background as well, the plan of action of the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments and Biodiversity to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is a platform that represents the voice of subnational governments within the CBD. We have been the coordinators alongside the government of Quebec for the past 2 years, and we have been doing contributions to the post-2020 process, and we want to share today our perspectives for the future, and of course the members' ambitions to the post-2020 era, and how subnational governments are creating momentum, and how are we building the future that we want, specifically within the CBD. Next slide, please. So very briefly, our plan of action commands the advisory committee with one strategic goal, and our objective for these 2 years, is to consolidate the advisory committee as the platform that enables permanent dialogue with the parties to the convention towards a strong subnational participation in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Of course, this is our strategic goal up to 2020. We have envisioned a series of actions that will get us there along the actions of the group, along the actions of the advisory committee as a group. We have outlined in our plan of action a specific efforts of each one of our states or our member regions, in which they have decided ways to, and efforts and actions and even commitments to reach this strategic goal. One being strengthening the collaboration with the national focal points within their own countries. So that's been very helpful, because we believe that to influence global decisions, we need to start within our own subnational regions and areas of influence, and then go from there up to the national governments, strengthen this collaboration, so whatever we do on the global scale can actually have an impact on the ground and can actually translate into reality. Next slide, please. So to be more specific, the contributions we have made to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework are briefly resumed in the ideas that I'll present now. These are some of the key messages that we advanced the CBD when they released this initial discussion document on the global biodiversity framework, and we advanced some of these ideas. Like Ingrid mentioned on her presentation, there are some core messages that are influencing the messages that finally locals, cities, and subnational governments are then responding to when it comes to this process. And you will see these messages reflected here. So for example, when it comes to the structure of the post-2020 framework, we are suggesting the CBD and the parties to consider the importance of vertical mainstreaming and cooperation with subnational governments as essential partners of the convention. Also, when it comes to biodiversity targets, we are talking about how targets should be comprehensive and should reflect the work with other frameworks and agendas within the UN. More specifically, of course, like Ingrid mentioned, the climate change, the Paris Agreement on climate change, and also the Sustainable Development Goals. It is increasingly more important that we mainstream biodiversity and other subject that is at the core of any transformative change that is to come. So we're talking also about that and about the implementation of these comprehensive agendas at the subnational level. When it comes to NBSAPs, we are suggesting that the new biodiversity framework considers the importance of having global sources of technical cooperation, financial resources, and tools specifically oriented to subnational governments' actions, needs, and characteristics as critical in the implementation of the CBD. As you well know, the scope of work of a subnational government is dramatically different to those of other levels of government, and we are requesting this recognition within the NBSAPs, for example, in this specific case, because there are some sources that are different for subnational governments, and we are inviting the parties to the CBD to consider this when it comes to NBSAP specifically. And next slide, please. Additionally, when it comes to integrating diverse perspectives, we are calling the attention on the plan of action on subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities that was launched and endorsed at COP10. We are asking for this plan of action to be either expanded, updated, and renewed because we have reached its timeline, and we believe we have worked towards the objectives included in the plan of action, and the new framework should consider the actions that we have done in the past years, and we should expand then the scope of what is to come for subnational governments and locals within the CBD and within the new framework, of course. We also talk a little bit about indicators and communication outreach. Of course, we are suggesting indicators should be specific, measurable, and realistic. But we are including a little mention that these indicators should be realistic and should ensure that not only all parties, but also subnational governments can actually report on them. Like you know, implementation also falls on the responsibilities of subnational and local governments. So indicators should reflect that responsibility for subnational governments. Also, communication and outreach. We have realized that raising awareness is fundamental and should be included somehow in the new framework. Moving on. So basically these are our key messages, and these key messages have shaped the interventions that we as advisory committee continuously do within this bigger and broader post-2020 process. More specifically, we are representative from the government of Quebec, Mr. Jean Lemire, who is the special envoy for climate change and Arctic issues for the government of Quebec, and also co-coordinator of the advisory committee, was present at the Trondheim conference on biodiversity, and he was able not only to advance these messages that I mentioned earlier, but also to reflect on what is going on at the heart of the negotiations. So not only he was our special envoy was able to share our messages, but also was able to get the impressions of what is going on at the heart of the negotiations, and some of the key conclusions that he can advance, for us are that, of course, there is the conference concluded that there's a call to find synergies with other UN conventions, as we have been speaking this morning. Also, there is a need to put more emphasis on how biodiversity loss is influencing food, agriculture, and health. And there is a feeling of being greatly ambitious for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, but also it's important to note that, as always in every negotiation, there are forces that may want to be more conservative and less ambitious. So we need to be mindful that the negotiations are going to be strong, and the ambience is going to be strong. So we need to continue working to pursue and to send our messages to the parties. There is no space for us to back down. We need to keep working hard, because though there are great ambitions and readiness for subnational governments' participation, there may be also some parties that may want to slow down the process or be more conservative, which is completely normal in any negotiation, as we have learned from the Paris Agreement experience. Also, there are opportunities to engage with the private sector. Apparently, the private sector is ready. It's more than ready to contribute, and would love to hear on clearer path, clearer directions on how to do this engagement, how to actually translate this into realities. Also, of course, there's the need to continue addressing the financing issue, because it's not very clear at this point. Like I said, the parties and the CBD seem to be ready for and seem to be taking as a given that subnational governments, cities, and local authorities are incredibly important for the process. So we believe now is the time to bring practical contributions and requests even to the negotiations and to the table. So we are more than ready to do that. Next slide, please. Specifically at the heart of the advisory committee, we are preparing sort of a roadmap to create this momentum for next year and for year 2020. I will not get into too much detail on the report we are doing, because I mentioned it on our last webinar, but yes, the advisory committee is preparing a report specifically on mainstreaming biodiversity at the heart of subnational governments. And with this experience, with the good practices that we have gathered over the years, we are hoping to contribute with recommendations on specifically these, how to actually what we have learned from the mainstreaming practice, how to overcome the obstacles that are still hindering the integration of biodiversity into other agendas, and how to do this possible in the post-2020 framework. Of course, we are participating at the first open-ended working group meeting that will take place in Nairobi. We are hoping to host a side event at the next SUBSTA. This event is to engage with the parties in a more conversational manner, and to socialize the conclusions that we will gather from a report. So at the next SBI, which will take place next year, at the beginning of next year, and the next SUBSTA, we can bring a more substantive document that has been consulted in dialogue with the parties, so we can have a stronger commitment, and we can move towards this strategic goal of the advisory committee that we have and that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. So yes, we are doing a series of events, of actions, of efforts, and actually every subnational government is welcome to join these efforts by just contacting Regions 4 through our website and our emails. Next slide, please. You can see my email over there. So please, if you're interested in knowing more or in being part of our efforts or initiatives, please just reach out. We will be happy to provide you with further information. Thank you very much, Tim. Over to you.
Great, thank you, Renata. We always really appreciate your inputs, and it's very informative to see how the two processes are in fact very aligned. So thank you for that. Now I'm going to try play a recording from Oliver, just with some feedbacks, outcomes, and next steps from a few different events that have happened, some of which have already been mentioned. So please be with us technically, and hopefully this will be able to work.
Of local and national governments to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And I'd like to touch on a few recent events and how they influence the roadmap and the activities of this group that is coordinating the contribution of those players to the post-2020 framework, to COP15, and to the work of the convention in general. So I won't repeat the points I raised in the last webinar in which I participated. In that occasion, I outlined what is the general roadmap for local and subnational governments in the post-2020 framework, particularly regarding the open-ended working group that is working on this theme to develop this framework. There are 3 meetings, they're posted. So this, what I would like to bring in today is what comes to this process out of 3 specific meetings and a possible 4th. The first one is the summit of the nature of cities in Paris in June of this year. The second is the Trondheim conference. I will make a few comments on that, even though I know that through Regions 4 and through the advisory committee, there might have been news on this before. I would also like to share with you the meeting of the Abu Ra Valley Metropolitan Authority led meeting on the role of metropolitan areas in the post-2020 framework and what kind of role they play in that. This happened in the city of Medellin in July. And then finally, I wanted to call attention to a meeting that may come up for subnational governments related to the government of Scotland. So first and foremost, the meeting in Paris, which was organized around a network called, it's around a blog run by David Maddox called The Nature of Cities, was very productive. It was a very diverse speaking opportunity for cities and many other players related to cities in communication, in arts, in social sciences, in hard sciences, in economics, in urban planning, in biodiversity, a lot of players. And I think for this meeting, the most relevant outcome was a roadmap towards living in harmony with nature as a 2050 vision, but more concretely, a roadmap agreed between local and subnational governments from here to COP15, what it is that cities and subnational governments and other local authorities, what it is that they desire, what it is they envisage. It's a very concrete document that came out of the Nature of Cities Summit in Paris. So I recommend people to have a look at it. One of the conclusions was that the Cities with Nature Initiative platform and website should receive full attention from all players as the central reference platform for cooperation and for updating on information on what is happening, and also as a platform for concrete commitments to the action agenda for nature and people. So this was a very fruitful meeting, and we look forward to more follow-up from it in cooperation with colleagues from the EU expertise, France, and with ITLE and with many others. Second, in terms of the Trondheim conference, I just want to call attention that in the pre-session document to this conference, there was an invitation for subnational and local governments to participate in the process of producing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So there is text in the pre-session document inviting subnational and local authorities as part of the action agenda for nature and people. So there was a request for that, so I know that there was a contribution, but I also want to say that subnational and local authorities and governments are mentioned in the co-chairs report, mentioning particularly the importance of urbanization, but also very clearly saying that there is a lot of wealth of experience and important contributions coming from both local and subnational governments. So I wanted to call attention to those two outcomes, really, of the Trondheim conference. Later on, I want to report that ICLEI was very much a player, along with the authority of the Valle del Aburrá, the Metropolitan Authority of this group of 10 municipalities, including Medellin in Colombia. The meeting was very successful because it brought experts from all over the world on metropolitan areas together to define what is exactly the contribution of that level of municipalities cooperating along a consensus-built plan in most cases, and how essential that level of organization is for the management of urban demands on nature, to ensure that the benefits of nature come to urban citizens. More and more, it is clear that metropolitan area authorities are involved, and that they have the means and the tools to exert their best capacity in contributing to the solution to those urban-rural linkages in which really metropolitan areas have a central role. So in the meeting in Medellin, which was hosted by the Metropolitan Authority of Valle del Aburrá, which really has a great example of reducing the incidence of air pollution cases per year by recovering wetlands, by recovering small rivers and mountainsides, and restoring nature into city, and also by making citizens aware and promoting public transportation and soft mobility alternatives for the population. Education, there are a number of issues that were considered. So there are great examples to be shared also from Japan, from Canada, and other places on the role of subnational, not the level between subnational governments, in fact, and municipalities, which in this case is, in the case of conurbations, the constitution of metropolitan areas as such. Water was also very much an issue. The water security issues, comparisons were made between Cape Town metropolitan action and Sao Paulo metropolitan action in Brazil, though the comparison of both was extremely rich, and of course many correlations could be made with the situation in Medellin and in its surrounding 9 municipalities. So those were very important contributions. Out of that meeting came a statement of metropolitan areas towards the post-2020 framework, which endorsed, in fact, the first document, which was the roadmap produced in Paris. So basically, the Medellin meeting reinforced the roadmap produced in Paris and added specifics about the role of metropolitan areas. And I think this may be a lesson to be learned in this process, is that while everyone in this call obviously has the general goal of making sure that the role of subnational and local governments as a whole is heard clearly in the post-2020 framework in all of its components, we also want to make sure that there is an understanding that each level has specific requirements and mandates and capacities, and that those of subnational governments are different from those of metropolitan areas, are different from those of municipalities and cities. So we need to look at each of those levels of governance and see which ones are best positioned to solve what kind of problem. So I think the last quick meeting was the one that there is a possibility of the Government of Scotland is in conversations with Regions 4 and with the Secretariat for the possibility of hosting a meeting of subnational governments specifically. We do have in the roadmap that resulted from Paris, there's a number of meetings which I'd like you to have a look at that will bring in the voice of cities as well. And so there might be one that will look at the perspective of subnational governments. That would be a very nice way if we have the output of metropolitan areas from Medellin. Several meetings bring in the perspective of cities with the coordination of a number of partners coordinated with ICLEI, but there are other initiatives, goals, and there are the Urban Alliance and many other initiatives that will contribute to this process. So I think in the larger perspective, it is important to note that there is an ongoing work of the open-ended working group on the post-2020 framework. Please have a look. The meetings have all been defined at the end of August, beginning on the 27th in Nairobi. There is the first meeting of the open-ended working group for the post-2020 framework. The second one is scheduled in February 2020 in Kunming, China. Great opportunity to involve Chinese partners. And the third one is scheduled for July 2020 in Colombia, which is, for instance, through ICLEI's leadership in Colombia, with the authority of Aburrá Valley being the ICLEI representative for Colombia. This is an opportunity to take advantage of Colombia hosting the third group meeting to bring at each level a separate message. For the first one in Nairobi, it's about elements of what could be the framework. In the second one in China, it is much more concrete already. We need to see what are the concrete achievements of every level of subnational and local governments. What are the ambitions and what are the needs of this group? And then at the third, of course, in Colombia, in July next year, there needs to be already a very clear demand and offer list so that parties can position themselves productively when they approve within a few months the post-2020 framework. So I think with this, I hope to have revised the options where we stand. It's important as well to consider that there are ongoing processes in which local and subnational governments are involved with the Secretariat through all of the partners, including the IUCN's alliance, including, of course, ICLEI, Cities with Nature, the whole platform that supports that, including the roadmap that also receives the support of the Nature of Cities and of Expertise France and the European Union, that roadmap, including the group of leading subnational governments for the Aichi targets, including other regions 4, of course, and its many initiatives, and many other partners that we hope to join in this work. But it's important to call again, to close attention to at least 3 levels in which you are already engaged with the Secretariat. One is on the long-term approach on mainstreaming. We have an informal advisory group in which ICLEI is the official representative of local and subnational governments, and in the extended network constituted to support the work of this group. Regions 4 is represented through Sao Paulo, and so we hope to hear your voice, and we are hearing your voice in this process for mainstreaming. Then there is the resource mobilization working group. There will be information about that soon available to the mainstreaming group. You will be accessing that as well. We have an ongoing process to develop a strategy for resource mobilization to support the post-2020 framework. So this also will be important to hear the voice of local and subnational governments in this process. And finally, there's a capacity building plan and strategy for 10 years which will delineate what the parties will invest as a priority in terms of capacity building. And I think we have a lot to say about the needs for vertical cooperation, not only horizontal across the themes, but vertical in terms of integrating every level of governance. With this, I think I have concluded my thoughts, and I look forward to further engagement. Thank you very much.
Okay, so in his absence, thank you to Oliver. Those were his inputs, and as I've mentioned, he will be presenting these inputs again in the second session this afternoon with a presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mr. Xu Zhu, who is our Regional Director in ICLEI East Asia. And Xu, if the platform will allow us, over to you for about 5 minutes to give us a bit of an update on the event.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Could you hear me now?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, everyone. I'm joining the meeting from Beijing. I would like to report back on the outcome of the local biodiversity workshop held in Beijing on 18th of July, as well as another NGO consultation workshop hosted by Chinese Ministry of Ecology and Environment last week. So I already shared the program with Timsy, but let me just be briefly introducing this program. That this is one of the consultation workshops in the towards the COP15 that we want to bring together the Chinese stakeholders, in particular the cities and regions, and also a few related organizations and the ministry agencies to discuss the roadmap towards post-2020 framework, as well as to build the awareness and understanding about the urban and local biodiversity actions. So we got 4 Chinese cities and regions to join the workshop. They are the Yunnan province, the host of COP15, Beijing city, Qinghai province, as well as the city of Chengdu. These 4 regions. And also we invited the government of Singapore, as well as the city of Bonn from Germany to share their relevant experiences. We also got the active participation of partner organizations, including the World Bank, the GIZ, and also a Chinese partner called the Tongheng Research Center for Landscape Architecture. So the participants shared their practices about the local biodiversity actions, and also their concerns or perspectives and recommendations about the roadmap. Also, we designed mainly 5 questions to discuss about the role of urban biodiversity, the commitment, ambitions of local subnational governments, and also what the need for further support to local and subnational government for implementation and actions in the future towards the post-2020 framework, and also any existing programs or opportunities that related that could further enhance subnational government actions, and also how the science and policy interface could be enhanced. So around this, we had a very interesting discussions. I just want to make it very brief here, is that from local government's perspective, I think the most needed thing is actually to raise the awareness about the urban biodiversity actions in the context of urbanization and also the industrial development, in particular in Chinese context. Many of the cities pointed out at the local level that local leaders and the governments have not really mainstreamed biodiversity actions into their urban planning and land use, and also the overall sustainable development strategies. They still prioritize economic growth more than biodiversity protection and preservation. However, a few of these very specific actions are being taken. For example, in Yunnan, they try to balance the preservation of ecosystem of biodiversity together with the economic growth through promotion of ecotourism, and also to utilize several important natural resources to create job opportunities in Yunnan, which is also an underdeveloped regions in China. In Beijing, they promoted this red line, ecologic red line policy try to protect, divided Beijing into 3 different zones in terms of ecological control line, with also a urban development boundary, than to divide Beijing into 3 zones to control and preserve those ecologically vulnerable areas. And Qinghai is a typical example of China's national parks. Since last year, China has established 8 national parks. Qinghai is one of them, and they through this so-called 3 river source national park, they try to promote this people-centered preservation concept, and also encourage local people to actively participate in the biodiversity actions and cooperate with the government. GIZ actually shared also their experience in Southeast Asia on the participatory approach to encourage citizens' participation. So around the 5 questions that we discussed, all the cities and regions reported that they have, at least for those people from the local environment department, they all realize the importance of urban biodiversity at the local level. However, this has not been prioritized. This is also a common challenge now. So they feel there is strong need to enhance not only the public awareness, but in China's context, most importantly, the local government leadership's awareness and commitment to provide more support and resources, and put more support also from the central government for local and subnational biodiversity actions. Secondly, they need also support from international organizations, ICBD, and organizations like ICLE and partners, to provide more capacity building for them to understand how internationally are their relevant practices and experiences for Chinese cities to learn and also to improve, and what kind of good solutions are there to help balance the development of economy and biodiversity preservation and ecosystem preservation. For Chinese cities, they also reported that the most needed is actually not a financial support, because most of regions are resourceful nowadays due to the development of economy of China, but more about the good ideas, good solutions. Then, of course, from ICLE's perspective, we also encourage them to put their need and also to actively participate in international platforms like the Network of Cities and also the Nature's with Cities knowledge sharing platform. Another point raised by the participant is about how to demonstrate the long-term benefits of preservation of biodiversity and ecosystem for urban sustainable development. In particular, some cities said that they need to show this to the local leaders in order to change their mindset and perception that biodiversity preservation actions are not only an investment for future. So World Bank made a comment that saying that they are doing a project for China, a technical assistance project for China, to help some Chinese cities to do the natural capital system. So in order to help calculate the benefits. This is also something welcomed by the Chinese cities and regions. And also some Chinese experts raised the issue about the lack of attention from the science and the research community about urban biodiversity, at least in China's context. So this need to be further enhanced. And in terms of the interaction between science and policies, all agree that this is very important to connect both and also reinforce the relation through the IPBES and other frameworks. However, so far, I think there might be also a strong need to promote the dialogue between science and the local leadership. So not only to bring the technical or working level staff from government to have interaction with the science community, but also to promote this science knowledge and scientific conclusions, evidence about the long-term benefits of biodiversity protection to the local leadership and also to the national government. So that's the result of the workshop. I also want to make a few comments about the NGO consultation workshop that hosted last week by the MEE Ministry of Ecology and Environment. in Beijing that ICLEI was invited. The main conclusion is that ICLEI was the only one organization among all these around 20 Chinese and foreign NGOs in that workshop tried to promote the local and subnational biodiversities in preparation for the COP15. So this has been taken by the ministry, and in particular, the MEE Deputy Director asked ICLEI to help develop a proposal about how to further mainstreaming urban biodiversity for China. They want to take it as a good reference for their preparation. Secondly, they also agree that these local actions are very important in the CBD framework, and also towards the preparation of the COP15 and also the post-2020 framework. But I think the ministry is currently overwhelmed by the preparation, in particular with a focus on the negotiation, but have not really attended enough to the local engagement and the promotion of the COP framework. So that was also observed during the workshop 2 weeks ago, that not many cities, a list of the participating cities and regions, they are not really informed enough, including Yunnan province, about the whole plan and also their role in the process. At least they have no idea so far. So we also stressed this during the NGO consultation workshop. And one of the good opportunities is that the ministry will establish several work tracks, they call it, or work streams. One of the tracks I have advised them is to focus on local and subnational governments. However, we need to follow up on this, try to convince them to include this as a work track towards the preparation. And China is working closely with the New Zealand on the UN Climate Summit this September in New York to co-chair the natural-based solutions work streams. And China also reported that they are working closely now, also approached by the Norwegian government to partner on NBS and also biodiversity actions. I hope that this for this our partnership, all the local stakeholder subnational biodiversity actions stakeholders could be also involved. From our side, our team will work closely with other ICLEI offices, CBC, and also CBD and other partner regions to try to tap these opportunities, try to follow up to move forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Xu. It's wonderful that you were able to join us, and to everyone on the line, this recording of Xu will be played in the second webinar, the second session today. So Xu, we really appreciate it, and to all of our speakers, thank you again for supporting this progress, for joining us in this journey, and I'm going to open the floor. We don't have much time. We've gone over time, but I'm going to open the floor quickly if there is any very burning question. Otherwise, thank you to everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you next time for the 5th webinar in the series. So if there are any very quick questions. Okay, in that case, we will close, and we look forward to, for those who are able to join us this afternoon, it's 3 p.m. South African Standard Time, or GMT +2. Otherwise, we look forward to you joining us in the next webinar. Thank you to everyone, and again, a huge thank you to our speakers.